Jana will introduce today's speaker.
It is my enormous pleasure to introduce Sandra Florian. She is a postdoctoral fellow at the Population Studies Center at Penn. She earned her PhD at USC in 2016. Sandra's work lies at the intersection of studies of mobility, immigration, and fertility, taking care to examine both how childbearing matters for socioeconomic incorporation, and also how socioeconomic incorporation matters for fertility. Her single-authored work has been published in both the Journal of Marriage and the Family and Social Science Research, and she's also been co-author on a number of other papers, including with Lynn Casper as well as others. We are enormously grateful to have you. Please join me in welcoming Sandra Florian.
Thank you everyone for having me. Thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure for me to be here. It's a great honor to present this work with you. This is, I titled it Immigrant Women's Labor Market Incorporation, a double-cohort approach. And it's work in progress. I want to acknowledge my co-authors, Emilio Barrado and Chenua Flippen at UPenn as well. So, as female labor force participation has increased in the US, women have gained importance as economic providers for families. In the US, immigrants provide a significant share of the labor force. And in 2016, it was about 17%. However, most of the literature on immigrants' economic assimilation has focused on men. And there's been less attention paid to the economic assimilation experiences of women, immigrant women. Now, this is in part because most traditionally, immigration to the US have been led by male workers, but there has been a shift in the gender composition of immigrants, and now there is more immigrant women that are arriving, and many of them are joining the labor force.
Is there any, the old pattern of the man coming first, getting settled, and then bringing the family, does that ever reverse itself? Is there a significant number of women arriving alone?
There has been an increasing number of women arriving alone since the end of late 70s, early work in gender and migration by Pierrette Honanu-Sotelo have found that even single women, Mexican women, will migrate by themselves just looking for jobs, in the service industry, like cleaning, as domestic work. So there's been an increasing trend. There's still some women who come and join their families, but it's less of a pattern. So I'm going to be focusing on more recent waves, since the 1980s, so with immigrants, because that pattern kind of changed, in the late 70s and early 80s. So, given this importance of immigrant women as workers, it's crucial to understand their experiences of incorporation, and because it could shed light on female labor force participation in the U.S. in general, and also has implications for gender and racial ethnic inequality. It also has an impact for immigrant families and economic assimilation. So in this talk, I'm going to be talking about women's labor supply, and I'm going to measure this in a broad sense by labor force participation. At times, I might talk about employment, although employment is slightly different because women or people who are in the labor force include those who are employed and those who are looking for jobs, the unemployed. So although there's a difference, so when I'm talking about labor force participation or employment is shorter, I'm referring to labor force participation, and this is a broader measure of capturing immigrant women's labor supply. So immigrant women have been said that they are disadvantaged in labor market outcomes. They have, in general, low employment rates, lower than immigrant men and lower than native-born women. Some of the prior literature have portrayed immigrant women as secondary workers. And this is in part based on early waves where women will migrate to accompany their husbands or join them later, as Josh was mentioning. And they were not migrating primarily as workers. However, there has been a shift in this trend, and now there's more women migrating, primarily looking for jobs. And there is evidence from some of the recent literature and also work in Canada that women are assimilated to the labor force in similar ways as immigrant men. So they are no longer as secondary workers as they were in the past. Now, there is great variation in labor force participation by nativity, by country of origin. We have a group of women who have significantly high levels of labor force participation, such as Filipinas, women from the Caribbean, and women from African countries. We have some other groups that have relatively low rates of labor force participation between 57 and 54%, such as women from Mexico, Korean, and India. And the rest of them are like in between, a little bit closer to US native born women. So we want to explore this variation. These variations in part are due because they have different histories of migration, and they come with different socioeconomic and demographic characteristics. And some of the literature has also mentioned, showed that there is, most of the time when immigrants arrive, they settle in an immigrant enclave, and then later on they move to different areas. And there is, employers usually use this type of network hiring process. So this could facilitate or not employment for women, but this might be more important like at first when they arrive. But women also, immigrant women vary in the time dating in the US. So the assimilation theory says that over time, immigrants will adopt the practices and behaviors that are dominant on the host society. So at the beginning, they are disadvantaged in most socioeconomic outcomes, but with time, they should like assimilate and close the gap with the native born. So the major explanations for variations in labor force participation are, of course, first, human capital. The theory says that individuals who have higher levels of human capital skills, such as education, and for immigrants also those who can speak English well, they have better prospects in the labor market. Whereas those who have lower education might have greater barriers for finding jobs. And also family responsibilities, and this is more specific for women. The literature has shown that marital status matter, and especially marriage may strengthen this like gender division of labor, and they might increase the time that women spend doing housework and reduce her time for work. And among these family characteristics, children, especially like young children, are the ones who have the higher effects of like reducing women's time in the labor force. Immigrant women have been said that they face a double disadvantage because they are disadvantaged not only by gender but also by their migration status. So many of them might be in a vulnerable situation to incorporate in the labor market. And
could you say just another word about immigrant status in terms of the
of being like recent arrivals and then assimilating over time?
But the legal status and the visa status of a woman, are you going to talk about?
I'm not going to mention it, but it's also important because groups differ a lot in their migration status. Like most women who come from Asian countries, they come with visas, whereas migrants from Mexico, there's a higher percent of undocumented workers, which might hinder also their labor force participation. That's a good point.
Does it hinder their labor force participation, or does it hinder the observation of them as labor force participants?
That's a good question. Probably both. Probably both. I did look at citizenship at one point, but immigrants who have been here for long enough and they don't necessarily become citizens, but they have been longer settled and they are like legally working. So this is part of why at this point I'm not going to be including this variable, but that's a very important one. So among demographic characteristics, these women also vary by their age, and we know that labor force participation kind of varies by over the life course. It starts like at lower rates, then increases and remains stable, and then decreases at older ages. But so we want to look at these differences by age, also by birth cohort and period, what time we're measuring employment. But for migration, for immigrants also, it's important to see how long they've been in the US, the period when they arrived, and their age at immigration. Most immigrant women come like in their early 20s. There's some that come later. Most of the time they might, like if you arrive after age 50, it's most likely that their adult children might have brought them to join the family. So it's a different type of maybe purpose of migration. So in the literature, there are some limitations. The first one is that most of the literature has, as I mentioned, focused on male workers. There has been less work on women's assimilation. And then most of this work has looked at the correlates of labor force participation. What explains this difference by country of origin, which are important and we also want to do. But there's been less work explaining the patterns of assimilation. Do they assimilate fast, slower, and what kind of explains these patterns? Then most of the work have used cross-sectional data because there is a lack of longitudinal data looking at immigrants' employments over time or immigrant outcomes over time. And there's been focused on years since migration, which is the way that they measure assimilation. And there's been less of work, although it has been now more important about looking at the difference by period of arrivals in migration cohort. And there's very little work on like age at arrival, almost no work either looks at this difference or control for these characteristics. This is in part because there is an identification problem, that these variables are all interrelated. And the traditional methods that we use for regressions, you cannot control for all of these variables at the same time. So we have to choose, and some scholars choose between, if you're going to look at years in the US and migration cohort, then you have to drop the period or like the year of the survey or drop some other variables. So, and then as I said, there's little work that looks at age at arrival. So the goals of this study is to look at, we want to explore also the variation in labor force participation by country of origin. We want to look at, we want to identify patterns of migration. As other works or other scholars have done, we also are interested in the advancement over time, so the slope of growth in labor force participation, but we also bring in an analysis of looking at the initial levels of labor force participation, which could be kind of the intercept. We want to also evaluate to which extent some demographic, socioeconomic variables explain these different patterns. And we want to do this applying this double cohort approach, which was first implemented in like the housing demography area by Double Myers, but hasn't been applied much in research in immigration. And this methodology is important because it overcomes some of the limitations with traditional methods, and you can estimate advancement over time, controlling with this by these other demographic factors that are also important. And I'm going to explain that this in a second. Yes.
So when you're talking about family characteristics, are you able to talk about extended family very much with these data?
No, that's something that we want to look a little bit later. With census data, I mean, you can link some of, like you can look at family size, that's for sure. But not necessarily you have you know who is in the home.
So I mean, even like co-resident grandparents, right?
Yes,
I'm curious the extent to which that's been identified as an important factor for, say, native U.S.-born Hispanics in terms of the child care that will help allow women to go into the labor force and maybe is less available for first-generation.
Yes, that's true. I had some prior work on like grandparents who assume responsibility for grandchildren. There's a lot of variation, and that's true that among immigrants it's more common that if there is a grandparent in the household, they usually claim responsibility for the child. I'm not looking at this point, but that's also a factor that may increase or may like facilitate women's incorporation to the labor force, especially like immigrant women where they're more like extended family, like in Hispanic homes. So that's a good point. Oh, okay. So data. I'm getting data for the U.S. From 1990 through 2016. We're pretty ambitious here. And we are getting all women who are ages from 16 to 64 who are not living in group quarters, and among immigrants, only those who migrated from during like the 80s, the 90s, or the 2000s, and that migrated after age 15. So we're not considering these children that were brought by their parents or they migrated at early ages. And by country of origin, we're separating groups by patterns that we observe. We observe certain groups that have high levels of labor force participation, such as Philippines, Caribbeans, and African women. Some that have kind of average levels of labor force participation, such as Europeans, South Americans, Central Americans, Cubans, Chinese, Canadian, and Vietnamese. And those who have low levels of labor force participation, such as Mexican women from India, Korea, and other Asian countries.
Here you're referring to labor force participation in the country of origin? Or
No,
do you mean
here in the US.
Here.
Yeah.
Is this also true of the country of origin, the same pattern, more or less?
No, actually, for example, that's very important because there is some literature that says that women that come from countries with higher female level of participation might also have higher level of participation in the destination country. That's the case for maybe some Asian or like Chinese. But that's not the case for Korean. Like Koreans in Korea, I think labor force participation is around 74% for women, and here it's very low. It's like 54%.
74?
Something, yes, for Korean women in South Korea.
Whoa.
And it has kind of increased. That's according to the World Bank charts that I looked at before. I wanted to check about like how are they correlated. So that's true. In general, it's true, but there are some patterns that we cannot explain, such as why is it that some groups that come from countries with higher labor force participation has so low labor force participation once they arrive.
So specifically Mexico, what is female labor force participation like
About
in Mexico?
45%.
So that would be low, considered
That
low?
would be lower. So these women would actually be having a slightly higher labor force participation than in their country of origin, but still low comparing to native born. So that's true. I mean, it does have an effect. So the methods. So I'm looking at, I was mentioning there is this identification problem that we usually want to look at the difference or controls for the difference by age, cohort, the birth cohort, and year. But as you know, if you have the year and you know the year of birth or the birth cohort, then you know how old this person is. So you cannot include them all in a regression model. Now, immigration adds some complexity because you want to control for, this is mostly like the most interesting variable, year since migration that measures assimilation. But it's also important the migration period, when they migrated, they may differ a lot in their characteristics, and also the age of arrival. But if you have the year of the survey and you have the year they've been in the US, then you know when the year they arrived. So you can only control for some of them. Most of the research that looks at year since migration and migration cohort, they drop year because they cannot include it in the model. So this is how the double cohort method works. So for everybody, you have the birth cohort, the year of birth. You have the current year. If you subtract the current year from the birth cohort, then you know how old they are at the current time or at that period. For migrants, you also have migration year. So if you just subtract the migration year from the current year, you get years in the US. And if you subtract the migration year from the birth year, you get the age of arrival. So in this double cohort method, you only use these three top variables: the birth cohort, the migration cohort, and the year, and then you deduct the rest through interactions. So as I mentioned, this was introduced by Myers and Lee, and we only use these three variables. You need to pick reference for a birth cohort and a year, and then you know, if you know the birth cohort and the year, then you know that's kind of like your age group reference, and you're gonna follow that over time. And for the foreign-born, you have migration cohorts, and the reference is the native form. So all migration cohorts are compared to the same, like yardstick, the same reference. Then you estimate the rest, the interactions. So birth cohort times year, and these are all dummy variables. If you follow a birth cohort over the years, then you get the effect of age. If you interact migration cohort times year, then you know how they are progressing over time. So that's years in the US, assimilation. And then if you interact migration cohort times birth cohort, then you get the effect of age and migration. So the first step is constructing these synthetic cohorts because we're using cross-sectional data. But instead of doing it the way that we usually do with infertility analysis, when we get for the same period and we just assume that it will go through the same fertility rates at each age, we do it in the other way. So we follow age groups over time, and then we follow them by because age is changing, but the year of birth is not. So we follow them by the year of birth. So for example, this is an example of women or individuals who were born between 1961 and 1970. In the 1990, they were age 29. 10 years later, they are age 30 to 39, and then 10 years later, 40 to 49, and so on. Now, we also create synthetic cohorts for migrants, so migration cohorts. Now, here I'm showing you an example where we have broken them in 5 years. There's no problem of having like either age groups or migration cohorts in 5 years and then your periods in 10 years. You just need to know that they slide like 2 boxes down every time. So those migrants who came here in 1985 and through 1989, in 1990 they were here for 1 to 5 years. 10 years later, they were here for 11 to 15 years, and 10 years later, and so on. This is a way that we created the cohorts I'm showing you for the 2 cohorts of those who migrated in the 80s and the 90s. We also have cohorts for those who migrated in the 2000s. So there's some caveats here. So we're using, and this is common to all data that use destination data, and that's something related to what you were mentioning, Josh. So we are assuming that there is a stable composition of cohorts. We cannot assess the effect of these cohorts changing over time, which could be a problem in the case of selective return migration. Many immigrant groups are not much affected by this problem, but like, for example, immigrants from Mexico can be more susceptible to this problem. During 2000 and 2009, there were more immigrants, like Mexican immigrants who returned to their country than came to the U.S. So this is, now some people say like if you are adjusting, if selective migration are like those who are less likely to assimilate are the ones who are more likely to leave, then you may estimate the effect of assimilation. But if these are people who have the lower skills, who are more disadvantaged in the labor market, and you are controlling for skills, you could somehow mitigate this problem, but you can still have a bias. So that's a caveat. Also, when we're using synthetic cohorts, we need data for at least 2 periods, so we can follow them at least 2 times. But that you need to discard the very young ones who are like at the end of the time that you cannot follow them anymore because they are too young, and those also the very old ones who were like 60 to 64 in 1990, then they age out of the sample. And also the double cohort method implies a lot of interactions. So it could be difficult to interpret the coefficients, and you need to keep track of who's the referent, especially because we're interested in age groups. We are tracking by birth cohort, but the same birth cohort in 1 year is not of the same age at the second year. So you can deduct the age effects, but you need to keep track. So it can be a little bit a lot more work because you don't get the effects directly, you deduct them through these interactions. And then sometimes, depending on like the size of your cohorts and how you follow them over time, you may not get like clear, like 0 to 5 years. Like if you want to look at the effect of migration 0 to 5 years, and then 6 to 10, you might get sometimes like a 1 to 6 or like 10 to 14. So it might vary. You don't get clear cuts as you usually report in some research. So this will be our model. So we use a logistic regression looking at labor force participation. We include the year, which is like the period, birth cohort, migration cohort, and then we include the interactions, birth cohort 10 year, which is the effect of aging, the variables, migration cohort 10 years, which give you the years in the US, and migration cohort times birth cohort, which give you the effect of age at migration. Yes?
Sorry, could we touch on, I'm just confused by some of your measures. I feel like maybe this is a good site to touch on measures somewhere. So originally you started by talking about economic assimilation, and then I assumed economic assimilation of women equals wages of women compared to majority wages of women in the same country. But then now I see that economic assimilation of women equals labor force participation compared to...
Well, economic assimilation involves different aspects, like what you do like in the labor market or like in economic outcomes. Part of it is like you start by being in the labor force. Then you might get employed or not.
And then is that compared to men in the U.S.?
No, I hear it's only
Who are we
women.
comparing them to in order to assess the assimilation part?
To native for women. So,
Native, female natives?
yeah, female native for women.
And then I assume that they have the same demographic, human, and household characteristics as the migrants?
I'm going to show the characteristics in a minute.
And then informal versus formal labor force issues like informal versus formal from the sending country, informal versus formal. Anyway, so
yeah, I mean that's another issue that also has to do with like legality, that we cannot. As I said, we're using data from the census, and whatever they like the variable they have for being in the labor force or not, that's the variable we're using. But I mean, there's a lot of ways that we can try to adjust for things, but there's no consensus really. So for now, I'm just looking at labor force participation, but later on we're going to look also at wages to see how it grows over time.
Are your BC, MC, are these continuous variables or are they
No, they
dummies?
are dummy variables in, so birth cohorts are in 5 years, from 1930 to 1989. Migration cohorts also in 5 years, from 1980 to 2009. And
And
the
year
years.
is those things. Yeah. Is there any way you can give us some intuition about how this, about the identification problem and how this avoids it?
Because when you're looking at age and you want to introduce age, the birth cohort and the year, well, you cannot do that, but because age is changing over time, whereas a birth cohort doesn't change, it's the same birth cohort over time. What changes their age, but you're controlling for age indirectly by interacting this migration cohort with the year. So every year you have to check how old they were in this year, so you can know the age. So you can introduce them all. You can control for all of these variables if you interact them, but you deduct like the effects this way. So the controls are, of course, controls for human capital, and we look at education. So less than high school, some college and more. English proficiency, whether they speak English well or not. Family variables such as marital status, and a number of children less than 5 in the household. So results. So here are some descriptive statistics. So at the top we have native-born women. They have a labor participation of 72% among this group of women. On the top we have those groups that have higher labor force participation than women in the US on average. In the center, those who are close, or from 72 to 67% of labor force participation. And at the bottom, we have 4 groups that have much lower labor force participation. Their only ranges from 54 to 57%. And at the bottom is Mexican immigrants, which is the largest group. There are demographic characteristics. So if we look at age, on average, among this group of women, native-born are 39, close to 40 years old. I kind of highlighted in green, and you can see some of the characteristics that we think might be associated, might facilitate, or might be associated with higher labor force participation, and in red or pink, I don't know if you can tell the difference, those factors that might be associated with lower labor force participation. So in general, women who are a little bit older, like more mature, they might have a slightly higher labor force participation than those who are very young, like such as immigrants from Mexico, who are only 37.4 on average, and women from India are 38 years on average. We have their age at migration, and we have the years in the US. In general, the longer you've been settled, the more likely that you may be in the labor force. There is a couple of groups that have higher labor for years in the US than others. There's 2 more newer arrivals who are women from Africa, although they have relatively high labor force participation, and women from India who have been here for 10 years on average. Yes?
Oh, could you just, without going into the ton, could you just help us remember what labor force, what if you're in school, what is it exactly, how does it define?
Labor force participation,
Yeah.
if you are in the labor force, there's a variable that says, are you in the labor, are you in the labor force, and are you working or looking for work? If you say yes, then you are in the labor force. If you say no, then you are not in the labor force. You are not looking for a job. And this is a way that we are measuring women's labor supply. So their willingness to work, whether they ended up employed or not,
Right.
it's a little bit different.
And,
So
and students, if you had a lot of students, that would lower.
yeah, I do control for being in school, but this is a discussion that I have with one of my co-authors, that should we drop women who are in school or not? And among women, like younger immigrants from Mexico, for example, there's only 64% that are in school, and more than half are in the labor force. Among women that come from China at that age, it's 94% that are in the labor force. So only 6%. If I get rid of the ones who are in school, I get with a very small, selected sample among certain groups. And we were also interested in looking at how this changes, being in the school or not. And we know that certain will have much higher percent, but we control for that. We will look at those differences. Yes.
Yeah, I noticed that you have a figure for Cuba of 68%, but then Caribbean 81% labor force participation. I'm just curious: is Cuba not included in the Caribbean? Is it somehow disaggregated? Is that a
Cuba is right
factor
here.
in the U.S. Census?
Cuba is right here,
Yeah.
separated.
Yeah.
So you're asking.
So my
what?
question is does Cuba not get rolled into the Caribbean? Would that possibly confound the figure? Is it double counted? I mean, or
Well,
is
they-
that just a
No, they are separate. These are exclusive groups. So they are not counted into the Caribbean groups. Also, I separated the women from the Dominican Republic. They are in Central America. I look at their characteristics before we merge them, and they have more similar labor force participation and characteristics to women in Central America than women from the Caribbean. But originally, the census will group them as Caribbeans. We separate them. Also, like they are not an English-speaking country, whereas many women from the Caribbean are more likely to speak English. As you can see here, like the percent of women who don't speak English well is pretty low in the top panels. Less than 15%, 10% that cannot speak English well, whereas the percent for like Hispanic, like Central American Cuban is more than 50%, and among Mexicans it's 70% who cannot speak English well. So there's like a lot of variation. That's kind of like the criteria that we use to group groups. I mean, we could have a lot of many more groups, but
So these geographic divisions, though, are yours, based on your,
yeah, on
More careful
the
with the
dependent variable and also looking at the characteristics. And then for family characteristics, we expect that those who have a higher percent of women who are married might have a lower need to work, and those who have more kids might have lower labor force participation. I'm just gonna show you the results because I want to get to them. This is just the age pattern of labor force participation for native-born women. And you can see there's a little bit of change over time by periods, but most of the increase has been to the later ages. For foreign-born women, for native-born women, it kind of increases quickly and then stays a little bit stable. There's a little bit of a dip during the childbearing ages. For foreign-born women, it seems like it continues increasing, but what is average doesn't mask differences because at each age range, you have women who have been in the U.S. for a longer period of time and you have recent arrivals. So let's look at different patterns of like labor force incorporation. This is the model for European women. And here I have them by age at migration. So these are migrants who came to the US when they were 15 to 19 years old. That means like in 5 years later, they will be 20 to 24 on average. 5 years later, they will be 25 to 29 and so on. This is for the next cohort that arrives between ages 20 to 24. And the next one, so at each point, the intercepts will be like their recent arrivals, and then we track them every 5 years. And this is how it looks for the rest, and we can see that those who migrate after age 40, especially those who migrate after age 50, they never kind of reach high levels of labor force participation. So I call this a gradual assimilation because this is what the theory says, like they come with relatively low levels, and over time they increase their outcomes and like close the gap with the native born. But now I want to show you some variation. So this is the same shape that I showed you before, like this is the case for Europe, and this is the case for women from the Philippines. They also show kind of like a gradual assimilation, but the difference is that they start at very high levels, about 70% of labor force participation upon arrival, and then they increase their labor force participation, but the slopes are not too high, and this is in part because they already start at pretty high levels, so they have kind of like a ceiling effect. They also reach much higher levels in general than women from Europe. So another group that has a similar pattern are women from the Caribbean. They also start their labor force participation at really high levels. By contrast, and women from South America have a similar pattern to those observed for women from Europe. Now, this is a different case with low starting levels. So this is women from India. On average, they start about like 40% of labor force participation. They also increase their rates of labor force participation over time. They do not reach kind of like the high similar levels, and it takes them much longer because they start from much lower points.
I think it might be helpful for me at least to understand this if I could see where the native born are in each chart, right? Because in order to think of it as assimilation, I would want to see how the native born in each category.
Yeah, well, the native born were here.
They're always
So-
there at every age? No.
That's the
Yeah.
pattern for the native born, and then I'm showing you like on average for the foreign born, and now I'm like disaggregating these patterns.
Yeah, but maybe in like dotted lines or something for each age group, because then you might be able to see that during certain ages, there might actually be fully assimilated, and then maybe there's a divergence later, I don't know. But it's really hard to, like, I don't know how this is.
I'm gonna show like some results like adjusting, and then I use all ratios, and the old ratio actually compares
Okay, good.
with the native born.
And all of these are plots from the models, right? So you're sort of
These
averaging
are-
across different census.
These are weighted,
years.
weighted observed characteristics, like that's upon arrival, like their labor for participation. This is
This is raw data, this is
Raw
not the
data.
results from the
But
model.
so
No-
it's
no controls.
averaging across a whole bunch of different censuses.
yes. So then I control for all of those differences. So then a similar pattern with like also gradual assimilation but starting low levels is found by women from Korea. They take much longer also to achieve the same levels, and they never reach kind of like high levels of labor for participation.
Can you go back to the slide? How do you, when we think about assimilation, which of this group is assimilating more? I could see arguing that the Indians are assimilating more because they're actually,
Have higher slopes.
their slope is much steeper.
Exactly.
So how are you interpreting this?
So this is kind of our argument that most of the literature have looked only at slopes, how they grow over time without really paying attention at their starting levels. So there are some groups that appear not to be assimilating much because they start from high points because their slopes are smaller. But so this is kind of like we're bringing in like the study of how you look at assimilation if you consider also the starting point.
But for you, it's like comparing the brown lines, I guess, incoming to 2024, are you saying that, are you making an argument that one of these groups is assimilating faster than the other? Or are you
No,
just kind of
here-
leaving that as up to
No,
us?
here's just an average of,
Yeah.
and now I'm going to show you a variation that that clearly shows that one group is assimilated faster than other, and this is right here. So here is a difference in the shape. So this is the graph for Mexican women. You see, like some of these groups have been already more than 5 years. There's little assimilation, and then assimilation comes like at much later time. And this is the same for China. And you see, this is the growth over time. So in this case, I'm calling this pattern a delay assimilation. So they don't, most of the assimilation occurs like after 10 years that they have been in the country. Whereas for China, women from China, all of the assimilation is like really fast and quick during the first 5-10 years after arrival, and then stays kind of flat. So this is kind of like a difference in the shape. So here it's kind of clear that there is a difference in who's assimilating faster, and definitely I'm calling, and the interesting thing is like these two groups started about the same entry levels. And when you run a regression and you look at the participation rates at arrival, Chinese from Mexican women don't differ too much at the starting rates relative to the native born, but they do differ a lot in the speed of like the growth rates over time. So another group that follows a similar pattern, this is kind of like ideal groups because no group is going to exactly match the same, but women from Central America, they also show kind of a slower assimilation, although they do start at much higher levels, about 50%. And other groups that follow this pattern of speed assimilation or accelerated are women from African, but they start at much higher levels, like a 50%, whereas women from other Asian countries, they start at much lower levels. So they are assimilating faster, but from very low levels. So there's more room to grow. These are coming like to the odds ratio. So here you compare, and this model is adjusting. And here, this is the odds ratio of labor force participation for women from Mexico. So I'm going to present only like the case of like the delayed assimilation and the accelerated assimilation. So here you can see that more Mexican women never kind of reach parity with native born after adjusting for their ages and the years they have been in the US. When you control for human capital, this is what we get. So human capital explains most of the difference, at least in the starting levels, from Mexican women and the native born. And it will increase assimilation like at later stages. And when we control for family characteristics, this is what the curve will look like. So family characteristics seems like it hinders assimilation, but at the early years, it doesn't have too much of an impact on later years. And this is kind of related with the argument of Parado that immigrant women tend to have a child once they arrive, so family responsibilities might be more of a hinder to enter the labor force at the early years. That was for the 1980s cohort. This is for the 1990s cohort. So again, we see similar effect of human capital characteristics for both groups and some of the effect of family at the early time. This is the case for Chinese women. So Chinese women, they quickly pass or reach the same levels as native-born women, and this is without controlling for human capital. Controlling for human capital doesn't explain too much of the difference, except for a little bit at the beginning. So there's some of them who may not speak English at the beginning. And if you control for family still explains a little bit of the difference, but the same as it is for Mexican women at the early years, but not so much at the later years. These are the results for the 1980 cohort. These are the results for the 1994 cohort. Again, even without control, we see that they already come with similar levels of human capital, so that doesn't explain too much of the difference between native, but for Mexican women, it did. So, to conclude, so regardless of nativity in general, most immigrant women eventually join the labor force, like more than 50% end up working in the US. So they are an important share or a constituent of the workforce in the US. There's great variation by country of origin, and we argue that these variations result from a combination from different starting levels, the intercepts, and different growth rates. Most of the literature that have looked at assimilation have looked at this growth in labor force participation or the different outcomes over time. We found about 3 patterns. In general, the gradual assimilation, which is like progressive achievement and closing the gap with native born over time. The delay pattern that doesn't occur until like many years after migration, and the accelerated pattern that it's pretty quick and during the first 10 years. But the overall labor force participation, like of different groups, also they're also affected by the entry levels. So in general, women who start at very high entry levels, they achieve also higher levels of labor force participation, but their growth of rate are smaller, and the growth is limited because they're already at such high rates. But so they are kind of like, you can see some ceiling effects for these groups. Whereas groups that have low levels of labor force participation at entry, they also in general achieve lower levels, but they have much more room for advancement. And so can we say that are they assimilated? This is like the question that you have said, you're ahead of my slides. So can we say that are they assimilated, they have like a greater assimilation than other groups? But we can argue that, well, if you start at such low levels, then you have much more room to grow. And of course, it takes them longer to achieve like parity with native born. Also, human capital characteristics explain the difference for some groups, not for others. For the case of Mexican women, it does explain most of the differences in initial levels of labor force participation, and it would actually speed their assimilation later on. And for Chinese women, it doesn't have much of a difference. Family plays a smaller role, but it does have an effect. Most of this effect is concentrated like in the early years after arrival. And when we look at, compare this with native-born women, it looks like family characteristics disadvantage more immigrant women in the labor force relative to, I mean, it hinders labor force participation for all women, native-born and foreign-born. But it hinders more, it disadvantages more like immigrant women in the labor market. And what we can think about all of this, maybe speculate that low entry levels and initial like slow growth might suggest that there might have, these groups may have like greater barriers for labor force incorporation. So, that's